Have you ever loved someone who made you feel like your emotions were too much? Like your warmth was overwhelming, your vulnerability inconvenient, your need for connection somehow unreasonable? You tried to be patient, you tried to be understanding. You told yourself they just needed space, that they were wired differently, that if you loved them calmly enough, gently enough, they would soften. But instead, the colder they became, the more you poured in. And the more you poured in, the more invisible you felt. This is the story of what happens when a super empath finally stops explaining, stops chasing, and stops feeding dismissive avoidant coldness. And trust me, the silence that follows is not weakness. It's the beginning of silent revenge. At first, it didn't look like revenge at all. It looked like love. Deep, patient, self-sacrificing love. The kind that notices every micro shift in tone. The kind that senses distance before it's spoken. The kind that tries to fix problems before they fully form. You felt the emotional walls. You felt the subtle pulling away, the delayed replies, the lack of reassurance, the emotional shutdowns whenever things got too close. But instead of stepping back, you leaned in. You reassured them. You minimized your own needs. You convinced yourself that if you could just be softer, calmer, less demanding, they wouldn't retreat. But dismissive avoidant coldness doesn't soften when you warm it. It survives on emotional distance. It deactivates when intimacy feels too real. When things get vulnerable, it pulls away to regain control. And here's the painful truth. The more you tried to bridge the gap, the more they felt engulfed. The more you tried to connect, the more they detached. It created a silent emotional tug of war, where you were always the one holding the rope, and you started losing pieces of yourself without realizing it. You stopped bringing up concerns because you didn't want to push them away. You stopped asking for reassurance because you didn't want to seem needy. You even started questioning your own emotional depth. Maybe you were too sensitive. Maybe you expected too much. Maybe love wasn't supposed to feel secure. But deep down, your body knew, your intuition whispered, something wasn't balanced. You were carrying emotional weight for two people. You were doing the processing, the communicating, the initiating, the repairing, and they were cold, calm, detached, sometimes affectionate, but only on their terms, sometimes loving, but only when it felt safe for them. This is where the silent revenge begins. Not with anger, not with screaming, not with dramatic exits. It begins with awareness. The moment you realize that explaining yourself for the 100th time won't make someone emotionally available, the moment you realize that overgiving doesn't inspire appreciation, it inspires complacency. The moment you see that your empathy has been feeding their avoidance. Because here's something most people don't understand. Dismissive avoidant coldness isn't confidence. It's protection. It's emotional self-preservation built on distancing. When closeness feels threatening, they deactivate. They minimize feelings. They convince themselves they don't need much. They may even convince themselves they don't need you. And when you chase, it confirms their internal narrative that independence is safer than intimacy. But when the super empath stops chasing, that's when the balance shifts. The first section of this silent revenge is withdrawal of over-explanation. You don't argue, you don't beg for clarity, you don't send paragraphs trying to make them understand how you feel. You stop translating your heart into digestible pieces for someone who refuses to taste it. And at first, they don't notice, because they're used to your emotional availability. They're used to you reaching out after distance. They're used to you repairing after tension. But then something changes. There's a space where your words used to be. There's a calm where your anxiety used to flare. There's a neutrality where your emotional labor used to live. And suddenly they feel it. Dismissive avoidants are comfortable with distance when they're the ones creating it. But when the other person steps back first, it triggers something unexpected, a loss of control, a subtle anxiety, a quiet curiosity. They may not show it openly. They may act unaffected. But internally, the pattern has shifted. You're no longer feeding the dynamic. The second section of this transformation is emotional neutrality. Not coldness, not cruelty, just balance. You respond, but you don't overextend. You care, but you don't overinvest. You mirror their energy instead of compensating for it. And this is where the real power begins. Because when you stop trying to prove your value becomes undeniable. When you stop overgiving, your presence becomes scarce, and scarcity creates awareness. They start wondering why you're not reacting, why you're not chasing, why you're not asking where things stand. They may test the waters, a casual message, a subtle breadcrumb, a small attempt to reestablish emotional access. In the past, you would have taken that crumb and turned it into a feast. But now, you take it at face value. You don't build castles out of minimal effort. And this is not about manipulation, it's about self-respect. The third section is the internal shift, because silent revenge is not about hurting someone. It's about reclaiming yourself. It's about realizing that your empathy is a gift, not a tool to win love. It's about understanding that you deserve reciprocity, not emotional scraps. You begin pouring the energy back into yourself. You reconnect with parts of you that were shrinking, your hobbies, your friendships, your goals. You glow differently, not because you're trying to make them jealous, but because you're no longer emotionally drained. And something fascinating happens. The dismissive avoidant, who once seemed so steady, so unaffected, starts to feel the absence. Not the dramatic absence of a fight, but the quiet absence of your emotional safety. They may not call it regret, they may not even consciously admit it, but they feel the difference. Because even the most emotionally distant person notices when warmth disappears. The fourth section is indifference, and indifference is more powerful than anger. Anger still means you care deeply. Anger still feeds the connection. Indifference, however, signals closure. It signals that you are no longer emotionally tethered. When they sense that they no longer have emotional priority in your world, something shifts inside them. Dismissive avoidants fear engulfment, but they also fear irrelevance. And when you stop making them the center of your emotional universe, they confront a new discomfort, being ordinary in your life. They might try to reappear stronger. They might suddenly offer the affection they once withheld. They might even act confused about your calmness. You seem different, and you are. Because you're no longer operating from fear of loss, you're operating from acceptance. Acceptance that you cannot love someone into emotional availability. Acceptance that connection requires mutual effort. Acceptance that your peace is worth more than chasing someone's potential. The fifth section is the ultimate silent revenge, growth. You don't need to block them dramatically. You don't need to announce your departure. You simply evolve. You become secure within yourself. You create boundaries without hostility. You expect consistency without apology. And if they cannot meet you there, you don't argue. You don't persuade. You release. And here's the part that hits hardest. When the super empath truly detaches, they don't come back halfway. They don't play games. They don't oscillate. They move forward fully. And that finality is what lingers in the avoidance mind. Because dismissive avoidants often process loss slowly. While you were grieving in the relationship, they were suppressing. While you were fighting for closeness, they were maintaining distance. But when you're gone emotionally, when you're no longer available as a source of comfort, validation, and understanding, that's when the delayed wave can hit. Not because you punished them, but because you stopped protecting them from the consequences of emotional coldness. This is the silent revenge. It doesn't scream, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't destroy, it simply withdraws access. It stops overfunctioning. It refuses to compensate for emotional unavailability. And if you're listening to this right now, feeling that ache in your chest, wondering whether you should keep trying, hear this clearly. Love should not require you to shrink. Empathy should not require self-abandonment. And connection should not feel like chasing someone who keeps stepping back. The most powerful thing a super empath can do is choose themselves without hatred, to walk away without bitterness, to heal without broadcasting it, to glow without explaining it. Because when you stop feeding dismissive avoidant coldness, you don't just change the dynamic, you change yourself. And that transformation, that calm, grounded, self-assured energy, that is the kind of silence that echoes long after you've left the room. That is the kind of silence that echoes long after you've left the room. And what most people don't tell you is that this silence doesn't just affect them, it transforms you in ways you never expected. Because once you taste emotional peace, once you experience what it feels like to not overextend yourself for crumbs of affection, you can't go back to begging for warmth. You can't unknow what imbalance feels like. And this is where the next layer of silent revenge begins. Not against them, but against the version of you that tolerated less than you deserved. The sixth section is about breaking the addiction to potential. You didn't just love who they were, you loved who they could be. You saw the guarded heart beneath the coldness. You saw the child behind the walls. You saw the tenderness they rarely showed, and that vision kept you hooked. You told yourself, if I stay long enough, if I love consistently enough, they'll open up. But loving someone's potential is exhausting. It keeps you investing in a future that hasn't arrived. And the silent revenge happens the moment you stop dating their potential and start evaluating their patterns. When you look at their behavior, not their promises, and say, this is what is real. That clarity is power. That clarity breaks the emotional spell. And once you stop clinging to who they might become, you free yourself from waiting. Waiting keeps you stuck. Acceptance moves you forward. The seventh section is where emotional accountability shifts. For so long, you carried the emotional weight. When they pulled away, you asked what you did wrong. When they went cold, you examined your tone. When they seemed distant, you tried to be more understanding. But now, you stop internalizing their avoidance. You recognize that their coldness is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their coping mechanisms. And this realization is liberating, because when you stop personalizing their detachment, you stop shrinking yourself to fit inside it. You begin to see that your depth wasn't too much. It was simply incompatible with someone who fears emotional exposure. That truth may sting at first, but it also releases you from self-doubt. And when you no longer blame yourself for someone else's emotional limitations, you stand taller, you speak calmer, you detach cleaner. The eighth section is the uncomfortable stillness. This is the part no one glamorizes, because when you withdraw your energy, when you choose peace over pursuit, there's a quiet loneliness that follows. You might miss them. You might miss the small affectionate moments. You might question whether you acted too quickly. But here's what matters. You don't break your boundary to soothe temporary discomfort. You sit in it. You allow yourself to grieve, not just the person, but the dream you built around them. This grief is sacred. It is proof that you loved sincerely. But instead of running back to familiarity, you allow the loneliness to cleanse you, and something beautiful happens in that stillness. You rediscover your emotional center. You begin to feel whole without needing constant reassurance. You realize that your nervous system feels calmer without the emotional roller coaster. That calm becomes addictive in the healthiest way, and you start wondering why you ever settled for chaos disguised as chemistry. The ninth section is when the shift becomes visible to them. Energy changes before words do. Your replies are steady. Your tone is balanced. You're not cold, but you're no longer emotionally exposed. You don't overshare. You don't overinvest. You don't try to convince them of your value. And this is where dismissive avoidant coldness starts to feel unfamiliar, because they were used to you leaning forward. They were used to your reassurance. They were used to you filling emotional gaps. Now there's space. And in that space, they are left with themselves. They may test your availability. They may send subtle signals. They may attempt to reestablish the old dynamic. But the difference now is that you are no longer responding from fear of losing them. You're responding from discernment. You observe. You evaluate. You no longer assume effort where there is inconsistency. And when they sense that you are no longer emotionally hooked, something shifts inside them. Because for the first time, they are not in control of the distance. The 10th section is the quiet empowerment of standards, not ultimatums, not threats, standards. You begin expecting consistency. You begin expecting emotional availability. You begin expecting effort that matches yours, and you don't apologize for it. The super empath often confuses unconditional love with unconditional tolerance, but they are not the same. Loving deeply does not mean accepting crumbs. Being understanding does not mean abandoning your needs. And once you internalize that truth, you stop negotiating your worth. If someone cannot meet you with presence, you don't chase them into it. You simply step aside. This is not revenge, fueled by bitterness. This is evolution, fueled by clarity. And when someone realizes they can no longer access you through minimal effort, they feel the shift profoundly. Because access to you was never small. It was privilege. And now that privilege requires reciprocity. The 11th section is where healing becomes visible in your aura. You start glowing differently, not because you're trying to prove something, but because emotional peace changes your posture. It changes your eyes. It changes your energy. You laugh more freely. You sleep more peacefully. You think more clearly. You no longer replay conversations in your mind, searching for hidden meanings. You no longer decode mixed signals. You take things at face value. and that simplicity is freeing. The dismissive avoidant may watch this transformation quietly. They may scroll past your presence online. They may hear about your growth indirectly, and something inside them may feel unsettled because the version of you they remember was accessible, emotional, available. The version of you now feels grounded, centered, self-contained, and self-containment is intimidating to someone who relied on emotional distance to feel safe. The 12th section is the delayed realization. Dismissive avoidant coldness often operates on suppression. They detach quickly in the moment. They minimize attachment to maintain independence. But emotional processing doesn't disappear. It delays. And when the dust settles, when your absence becomes consistent, when they realize you're not circling back, the weight of what was lost can slowly surface. It might show up as curiosity. It might show up as nostalgia. It might show up as subtle attempts to reconnect. But by the time this wave hits them, you are no longer standing in the same place. You are no longer waiting for emotional breadcrumbs. You are no longer hoping they choose you. You have already chosen yourself. And here's what makes this silent revenge so powerful. You didn't destroy them. You didn't humiliate them. You didn't try to hurt them. You simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of their emotional avoidance. You stopped compensating for their distance. You stopped cushioning their detachment. You let reality speak for itself. If they rise to meet you with growth and accountability, that's a new story. But if they remain distant and emotionally unavailable, you no longer try to rescue them from themselves, because you finally understand that love is not about saving someone from their fears. It's about meeting someone who is willing to face them. And as you stand in this new version of yourself, calm and unshaken, you realize something profound. The coldness that once wounded you was never stronger than your empathy. It only felt powerful because you were pouring yourself into it. But once you redirected that empathy inward, once you stopped leaking energy into a one-sided dynamic, the balance restored itself. The silent revenge of a super empath is not revenge in the traditional sense. It is reclamation. It is boundaries. It is emotional maturity. It is walking away without slamming the door. It is outgrowing someone without announcing it. It is loving yourself enough to refuse emotional starvation. And if you are in that space right now, if you are resisting the urge to text, resisting the urge to over-explain, resisting the urge to chase, know this: your restraint is strength. Your silence is healing. Your withdrawal is not cruelty. It is self-preservation. Because the greatest shift happens when you realize that you are never asking for too much. You are simply asking the wrong person. And once that truth settles into your bones, once you fully embody it, you stop seeing their coldness as rejection. You start seeing it as redirection. Redirection towards something warmer, something mutual, something secure. And this is where the story deepens. Not because they suddenly change, not because they come running back with dramatic confessions, but because you no longer need them to. The power dynamic has fully shifted. The super empath, who once trembled at the thought of losing them, now stands steady in the truth that losing someone emotionally unavailable is not a loss. It's alignment. The 11th section is the death of emotional bargaining. There was a time when you negotiated silently inside yourself. Maybe if I'm more patient. Maybe if I don't bring this up. Maybe if I give them space, they'll come closer. You kept adjusting your behavior in hopes of unlocking their warmth. You became smaller in certain moments, quieter in others. You rehearsed conversations in your mind, trying to say things in a way that wouldn't trigger their withdrawal. That bargaining was exhausting. It drained your nervous system. It made you hyper-aware of every shift in tone, every delayed message, every subtle sign of distance. But now, you stop negotiating for basic emotional presence. You stop trying to earn consistency. You stop proving that you're safe enough to love. And this is where something liberating happens. You realize that love should not feel like a performance review. It should not feel like walking on emotional glass. The silent revenge here is simple. You no longer audition for someone who refuses to commit to the stage. The 12th section is the unraveling of fantasy. When you first connected, there were moments that felt magnetic, conversations that felt deep, eye contact that felt intense. Those rare glimpses of vulnerability kept you attached. You held onto them like proof that something real existed underneath the coldness. And it did. But chemistry without consistency is confusion. Intensity without stability is instability. You were attached not just to who they were, but to how it felt in those brief windows of closeness. Now, as you step back, you see the pattern clearly: the push and pull, the warmth and withdrawal, the hope and disappointment cycle. And once you see the cycle, you cannot unsee it. The fantasy loses its grip. You stop romanticizing the rare highs because you're no longer willing to tolerate the emotional lows that follow. The silent revenge here is clarity. Clarity breaks attachment faster than anger ever could. The 13th section is emotional self-trust. This is where your intuition, the one you ignored for so long, becomes your anchor. You remember the early red flags, the subtle inconsistencies, the moments your stomach tightened but your heart overruled it. You silenced your inner voice because you wanted it to work, because you believed love required endurance. But now you listen. You trust the discomfort instead of explaining it away. You honor your emotional needs instead of dismissing them as too much. And something shifts internally. You stop fearing abandonment because you know you won't abandon yourself again. That is the real transformation. The dismissive avoidant may still operate from distance, they may still suppress, they may still detach when things feel intense, but you no longer chase emotional crumbs. You no longer betray your intuition to maintain connection. The silent revenge here is becoming someone who cannot be emotionally manipulated by inconsistency. The 14th section is the mirror effect. When you stop over-functioning in the relationship, when you stop initiating every repair, when you stop being the emotional glue, they are left facing the dynamic without your cushioning. Silence feels heavier now. Distance feels real. The comfort of knowing you would always reach out first is gone. And in that absence, they may begin to question, not necessarily out loud, not dramatically, but internally. They may replay conversations. They may revisit memories. They may feel the quiet weight of your absence in moments when they once relied on your reassurance. This is not about making them suffer. It's about allowing them to experience reality without your emotional labor buffering it. And if they attempt to reconnect, you respond differently now. You don't collapse into relief. You don't ignore the past pattern. You assess. You observe. You ask yourself, has anything truly changed? That question alone protects you. The 15th section is the final release, and this part is subtle but profound. You stop waiting for closure from them. You stop needing them to understand how much they hurt you. You stop fantasizing about a moment where they suddenly realize your value in a dramatic revelation. You release the need for their awakening, because your healing is no longer dependent on their self-awareness. You find closure in your own growth. You find peace in your own boundaries. You find strength in knowing you walked away with dignity instead of desperation. And this is where the silent revenge becomes complete. Not because they feel regret, not because they chase, not because they confess, but because you are free. Free from decoding mixed signals. Free from craving validation. Free from fearing distance. And here's the part that touches the deepest layer of the heart. You didn't become colder. You didn't lose your empathy. You didn't transform into someone unrecognizable. You simply learned where to place your warmth. You learned that empathy without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. You learned that love without reciprocity becomes depletion. And you decided that your nervous system deserved peace more than your ego needed to win someone over. If you're listening to this and you still feel that ache, still feel that pull, still feel tempted to break your silence, understand something gently. Missing them does not mean you made the wrong choice. Loving them does not mean you should return. Healing is not linear. Some days you will feel powerful, other days you will feel nostalgic. But do not confuse nostalgia with compatibility. Do not confuse familiarity with safety. Your body knows the difference now. The silent revenge of a super empath is not dramatic. It is disciplined. It is waking up every day and choosing not to text when your heart wants to. It is resisting the urge to explain yourself one more time. It is refusing to beg someone to see your worth. It is allowing your absence to speak what your words no longer need to. And if somewhere down the line they do come back softer, more aware, more emotionally available, you will meet them differently. Not from a place of hunger, not from a place of fear, but from a place of standards. And if they don't, you will still be whole. You will still be evolving. You will still be attracting connections that feel mutual instead of one-sided. Because here's the truth that changes everything. Dismissive avoidant coldness only holds power over the empath, who fears being alone. The moment you make peace with solitude, The moment you realize your own company feels safe, their distance loses its intimidation. You stop asking, why wasn't I enough? You start saying, I deserve someone who shows up, and that shift is irreversible. So if you are in the middle of this transformation, if you are choosing silence over pleading, if you are choosing growth over chasing, know that you are not losing love, you are refining it, you are raising its standard, you are protecting its depth. And one day when you look back at this chapter, you won't remember it as revenge. You'll remember it as awakening. An awakening that taught you that your empathy is powerful, but only when paired with boundaries. An awakening that taught you that love should feel safe, not uncertain. An awakening that taught you that the coldest goodbye can lead to the warmest future. And now, something even deeper begins to unfold. Because once you've awakened, you can never return to unconscious attachment. You can never unknow the cost of overgiving. You can never pretend that emotional coldness feels like love again. The chapter may have closed, but the transformation is still expanding inside you. The 16th section is about emotional sovereignty. For so long, your emotional state depended on their responses. If they were warm, you felt secure. If they were distant, you felt anxious. If they pulled away, your chest tightened. Your nervous system was tied to their availability. But now, you begin untangling that cord. You wake up, and your mood isn't determined by whether they texted. You go to sleep without replaying conversations. You begin regulating your own emotions without waiting for reassurance. And that shift is monumental. Emotional sovereignty means your peace is no longer outsourced. It means you don't hand someone else the remote control to your inner world. The silent revenge here is profound. You become someone whose stability cannot be shaken by inconsistency. And when you no longer react to coldness, coldness loses its leverage. The 17th section is the collapse of illusion inside them. Dismissive avoidant coldness often carries an unspoken confidence. They'll always be there. It's not always arrogance. Sometimes it's simply pattern recognition. They're used to partners chasing, used to emotional availability, waiting patiently, used to someone reaching out after distance. But when you don't, when weeks pass and your energy remains steady, when you don't circle back to repair what you didn't break, that illusion starts to crack. And even if they don't admit it, even if they posture unaffected, something inside them registers the shift. The emotional safety net they once leaned on is gone, and in its place is uncertainty. They may feel curiosity, they may feel ego bruising. They may even feel the unfamiliar sting of rejection, because for once, they are not the one choosing distance, they are experiencing it. The 18th section is your rebirth into discernment. You no longer romanticize potential. You no longer confuse intensity for intimacy. You no longer ignore inconsistency, because the chemistry feels strong. You've learned that peace feels different than passion, mixed with anxiety. Peace is steady. Peace is reciprocal. Peace doesn't make you question your worth. And as you move forward, you start recognizing red flags earlier. You don't shame yourself for having a big heart, you simply guard it wisely. Your empathy is still there, your depth is still there, but now it's paired with boundaries. Now it's protected by standards. And this makes you magnetic in a completely different way. Not magnetic through overgiving, not magnetic through emotional labor, but magnetic through grounded confidence. The silent revenge here is elevation. You rise above the pattern instead of repeating it. The 19th section is the quiet confrontation of grief they may eventually face. Suppression works temporarily. Emotional detachment feels powerful in the moment. But attachment doesn't vanish simply because it's denied. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it lingers quietly beneath distractions and new faces and busy schedules. And when enough time passes, when the ego settles, when the noise fades, there may come a moment when they truly feel your absence. Not just the absence of messages, but the absence of your understanding, your patience, your emotional depth. They may remember how you saw through their walls without judgment. They may remember how you stayed gentle, even when you were hurting. And in that remembering, there can be a weight, not necessarily dramatic regret, but awareness. Awareness that something rare slipped away. And here's the part that matters most. By the time that awareness surfaces, you are no longer waiting for it. You are no longer dependent on it for closure. The realization, if it comes, arrives too late to disrupt your peace. The 20th and final section is your integration. This is where everything you've learned becomes part of who you are. You no longer identify as someone who was hurt by coldness. You identify as someone who grew because of it. You don't speak about the experience with bitterness. You speak about it with wisdom. You understand now that dismissive avoidant coldness was never about you being unlovable. It was about emotional defenses colliding with emotional depth. You understand that you cannot love someone into vulnerability if they are committed to avoidance, and you no longer take it personally. But more than anything, you understand yourself. You understand your patterns. You understand your triggers. You understand why you once chased, and instead of shaming yourself for it, you hold compassion. You loved deeply. You tried sincerely. You gave honestly. There is no shame in that. The only mistake would have been staying once you recognized the imbalance. And now, you walk differently. You enter connections slower. You observe more. You speak your needs earlier. You don't overinvest before reciprocity is proven. And you are not afraid to walk away at the first consistent sign of emotional unavailability. Not because you are cold, but because you respect your own heart. If you are listening to this and still feel that lingering attachment, let this sink in gently. Healing is not about erasing love. It's about transforming it. The love you once poured into someone who could not hold it is now being redirected into your growth, into your standards, into your future. And that redirection changes everything. The silent revenge of a super empath against dismissive avoidant coldness is not destruction. It is transcendence. It is refusing to dim your warmth while also refusing to let it be mishandled. It is choosing self-respect over emotional pursuit. It is walking away quietly and letting time reveal what words never could. And one day, you will meet someone whose presence does not trigger anxiety, someone who does not retreat when you open up, someone who does not make you feel excessive for having needs. And when that happens, you will look back at this chapter with gratitude instead of pain, because it taught you discernment, it taught you boundaries, it taught you strength. Until then, hold your silence with dignity, hold your growth with pride, hold your empathy with protection. Because the most powerful thing you ever did was not making them regret losing you. It was making yourself proud for choosing you.